Folksy folks, welcome to Fabric of Folklore. I am your hostess, Vanessa Y. Rogers, and this is the podcast where we unravel the mysteries of folklore. And in this podcast, we journey into folklore such as myths, legends, and fairy tales to understand where they came from, how they lasted so long, and why they still have significance today. Folklore, however, does not just pertain to oral lore. It includes traditions, jokes, and sayings. For example, did you know that the phrase peeping Tom is an iconic part of a legend surrounding a real person from the 11th century called Lady Godiva? The legend states that Lady Godiva once rode through the city streets on horseback completely nude in protest of her husband's unfair taxation of the populace. As the rest of the town shut their doors and windows, they looked away. Tom the tailor did not avert his eyes, and as he should have, and he was either killed or blinded, depending on the different versions of the tale. And that is where we get the phrase peeping Tom. So all of these sayings and jokes, they have history and they have significance. Context fills in that gaps and helps us to understand who we are as a culture and how we are evolving and what magical forced path we should choose next. So if that sounds like a podcast that you are interested in listening to, make sure you're hitting that subscribe button, either on YouTube or if you're listening on Apple Podcasts or Spotify or whatever podcast platform you're listening to. Make sure you hit that subscribe button so that you get those notifications every Tuesday when our podcast comes out. And today we're talking about fairy tales and folk tales and how they aren't just to entertain children, but their social and political significance and potential implications. Our guest is Jack Zipes. He's a happily retired professor from the University of Minnesota, whose focus on fairy tales has transformed the ways which fairy tales are analyzed. He's known for his lectures on German literature, critical theory, German Jewish culture, children's literature, and folklore. He's written 20 plus books on fairy tales and the like, and how they've evolved and the social and political significance of those works. He holds a PhD in comparative literature, and his political activism in the late 1960s led to his interest in critically analyzing fairy tales. So welcome, Dr. Zipes. We're so glad to have you.
Well, thank you for inviting me.
Well, I'm really excited to have you. Your books just sound absolutely fascinating. I haven't gotten to read an entire one, but they just sound so great. So can you tell us a little bit about your journey into the world of how you found yourself interested in folk tales and fairy tales?
Yes. Well, I must say that I never knew that I would take such a great interest in fairy tales. I did my graduate work at Columbia University, and I wrote a book there about the romantic hero in American and also German literature. And in doing that, I had to read a lot of the works that were fairy tales or folk tales or legends. And I had a sort of very strong academic view of all of these folk tales and fairy tales that I studied. But it really wasn't until I got to the University of Wisconsin-Milwaukee, where I began. This was in the 1970s, and I was very interested in or in the question, why did many of my my colleagues, my friends, and so on, gave up after the Vietnam War stopped and didn't really continue to do all the changes like in feminism or racism and so on. And I realized that most of the people or young people are from very good families, and they don't have to worry after they protested. They could go back and just live their so-called normal lives. And instead of keep changing our society, making it more humane, more compassionate. And so I began reading books. I was at that time living with a young woman whom I had met in New York, and we both went to Milwaukee together. And she was studying childcare and children's literature. And I stole all her books. I began reading them, and I said, "My God, I really have to go into schools to see how and why children from different classes react to fairy tales." And so that was the beginning of my real great interest in fairy tales, because I became very upset by a lot of the theories that Sigmund Freud had and other psychologists. And I began writing a great deal about my experience with children uh, uh, from all over the world, because Milwaukee had a very diverse sort of elementary school. And I began exploring the how fairy tales or folk tales spread and influenced uh, people, and how they might be able to enable people to realize that there are other types of living. And so what happened was, I over the years I've come to look at the tales very, very closely, and looking at them as memes, and memes in a scientific way, not the way people always use the term memes. It's memes. The theory of memes was developed in 1996 by Richard Dawkins in England, a biologist, and what he meant by that was that memes are a bit of off information which enables society to continue to survive uh, disastrous events or different things in our lives. So let me give you an example of what really propelled me to look at fairy tales very carefully. Most people don't realize that Little Red Riding Hood is really a tale about rape, about the violation of young girls. It's a story about a young girl who goes into the woods and stupidly tells a werewolf where her grandmother lives. The werewolf goes there, eats the grandmother, gets into the bed, and then when she arrives, the girl, uh, the same thing happens. He eats her. Now, most people don't realize that the tale has no happy ending. In other words, in the folk tradition in the medieval times, this tale was told to alert young girls, because women were not allowed to leave villages, or shouldn't leave villages. It was dangerous and so on. And the tale was basically a tale that reflected um, on the situation in which young girls were, and so that they would learn a lesson, so to speak. It wasn't pedantic, because there were many versions. Sometimes the girl did survive. Sometimes the girl, more or less, escaped with the help of her grandmother and things like that. But the tale, it stays with us, and has stayed with us for hundreds of years now. When you go, and so the question is, there's a mimetic quality to a particular tales. Not every tale is this way, and the tales stay with us because we need these tales to reflect upon a certain situation in our society throughout the world that involves the raping of women or the violation of women. And once I grasped or did a lot of research, I wrote a book called The Trials and Tribulations of Red Riding Hood in the 1980s. And
Mhm.
the book was somewhat controversial. I was either people agreed with me strongly, and
Mhm.
particularly feminists, and or other people said that I was wrong, I was loony, or so, and so on and so forth. Um, but I know because I've seen I've lived in Europe and I've traveled widely. Also into Asia, and wherever I go, I ask to go into schoolrooms, and I ask I ask the children when I go into so in Slovenia, in Austria, and so on and so forth, in England. I ask them, "Do you know Little Red Riding Hood?" And they all raise their hands, and they say, "Yeah, we know." And it's amazing.
Uh-huh.
You can make test yourself. If you go into a school, they will think that they know the tale, and it's because the situation of women is still fraught with
Mm.
problems.
Mhm.
Every day, according to, and I don't have my historical book before me with regard to uh, tracing the facts about this, but every 4 minutes in the world today, a woman is raped or violated
Mhm.
in some way or another. So this tale will never go away. It's
Mhm.
mimetic. It will never, it sticks with us because we need that tale to deal with the the problem of violation of women. And things have improved. If we can see that through there are thousands of folk tales called Little Red Riding Hood. There's Little Green Riding Hood, and so on and so forth. All sorts of tales
Uh-huh.
that have been, and they all deal with this situation. Well, and I can also talk about other tales like Hansel and Gretel is is
Mhm.
is a fascinating tale because it's a tale about child abandonment. Now, and we know today the whole question. Hansel and Gretel also, if you go into a schools or deal with children or education, it's also a very important tale because it signals that something is wrong because we are abandoning and abusing our children, leaving them alone. Or,
Mhm.
uh,
Mhm.
even you can see it at the borders, well near Texas, from Mexico,
Mhm.
people, adults leaving their children so that maybe they can find a way in America to have a better life, or that's their dream,
Mhm.
and so on and so forth. So the tale of Hansel and Gretel is still a mimetic, valid tale that helps us. So I've spent many of my years, many studies. It's not always about this problem or these problems, but if we look at these tales carefully, they can empower us to deal with difficult situations in our lives. And that's
Mm.
why the politics of fairy tales, the best fairy tales, is significant with regard to sort of like the socializing process of men and young boys and girls, young men and women, and we can uh, see them in plays, we can see it in musicals, we can see it in films. All of all of the so-called fairy tales that are adapted in our modern times have a significance for us so that we can really idealize or dream of a better world. uh, Fairy tales are also estrange us from our when they're very imaginative. They're not realistic,
Mm.
and so the value of that is that they can estrange us from our daily lives, and
Mhm.
we can begin to think through the plots and what is happening in this other world, in this imaginative world. And they are powerful because as young people, we do not realize to what extent uh, various conflicts are occurring and that we must learn to deal with them. And fairy tales actually do enable us to a great extent to deal imaginatively uh, with another world that may be better than the world in which we live. We live today, for instance,
Hmm.
in a very troubled world. There are not only wars that are going on, there are terrible typhoons, like just recently in
Hmm.
Hawaii, and well, also in California. And we're
Hmm.
due the way we've treated the our planet is sort of shameful, and nature's
Hmm.
re, sort of rep, paying repaying us for the way
Yeah.
we treat nature, right? And so
Hmm.
again, the telling of these tales, and there are hundreds or thousands of tales that are mimetic, not all tales, but these are the tales that really we need to keep telling, changing the tales. For instance, there were a lot of tales going back to Little Red Riding Hood, in which Little Red Riding Hood outsmarts the wolf, and he gets punished by her. She brings friends or gets aid or something like that. But there are many, you name it. Every year there are new versions of Little Red Riding Hood that are being published in different
Uh-huh.
ways, also through the media. And that's one of the reasons why I still keep, I'm 86 years old. I haven't stopped writing about folk tales and fairy tales.
Hmm. Because they're ever evolving and they're always changing to the
Yes.
situation that we are currently in.
Yes. And quite often, because I've dealt so long with these fairy tales, uh, artists and writers and so on, they send me their works. And they want, they've read perhaps a book or two that I've published, uh, and I don't publish them to be pedantic or to really stress that you must listen to what I'm writing. I write because
Hmm.
it's a necessity for me, and
Hmm.
it seems to be that for many people, uh, the genre of the fairy tale is perhaps the most famous genre in the world.
Hmm.
In part, it's been helped by Walt Disney or popular
Hmm.
or Miyazaki in Japan. These tales are influence all types of other genres that see the necessity or the importance that these tales might have to be adapted as an opera, as a play, uh, uh, as a let us say series on TV. So I've been involved in not only in the reading and writing of fairy tales, but I've dealt with actors, with musicians, with writers of opera, and so on and so forth. And it's been exciting and eye opening for me for my own life.
Hmm. Can you step back for a minute and define what a fairy tale is for us in contrast to, say, a folk tale?
Yeah, well, it's very strange that we talk about fairy tales because most of the tales that are fairy tales don't have any fairies in them. If you think about
That's right.
it, if you look at all the Grimm's tales or Hans Christian Andersen's tales and all the folk tales that have been republished and so on, generally speaking, okay, there's sometimes there are fairies, but the term fairy tale was actually invented in the 1690s by uh, a, a female writer, uh, and who uh, her name is Madame d'Aulnoy, and she was very famous along with Charles Perrault and other female writers in the 1690s in France. And it was up until that time there was no such sort of genre called fairy tale. Well, it was simply in French conte. Conte means Contes means tale, or in
Mm-hmm.
German Märchen, which is simply tale. Uh,
Mm-hmm.
in, Surprisingly, also in Latin, the term mythos did not mean myth; it just meant tale. And it
Mm-hmm.
wasn't until Madame d'Aulnoy came along in 1690s, and she used fairies in almost all her tales, and called them contes de fées, contes
Mm.
de fées. And conte de fées was fairy tale, and she did use fairy tales, and they were very prominent in her tales and also in other tales. This was a time when a lot of female writers were rebelling against Louis XIV, who actually had a lot of these women imprisoned for writing these tales and
Oh.
for yes, and it was very political. The writing of these tales, some of them were banished from France, from Paris, and had to go other ways because of the tales that they wrote. And so it was from this point on that the translation of Madame d'Aulnoy's tales and also Charles Perrault's tales in the 19th century, these tales began to circulate, and people call them fairy tales. So, what is a fairy tale? A fairy tale is certainly not a tale about fairies, although the fairies can become involved. It's a hybrid type of narrative, very imaginative, that in which transformation, magical or transformation, is at the heart of all these tales that we call fairy tales. That things that cannot possibly happen in the real world happens in these tales, and so it's this imaginative quality, or yes, I guess intrinsic quality
Mm.
in the narratives that are so imaginative that we don't know what to call them. We call them fairy tales because of the fact that Madame Domo invented this and labeled it, and it is different, say, from other genres. I mean, legends tend to be deal are based on some type of historical event or incident, whereas there's no reason in the fairy tales why anything happens. You can't put
Mm-hmm.
your finger. You can't when animals start talking, or when animals transform themselves into humans or humans into animals and so on. That does not happen in other tales. So, in other words, it's the imaginative quality, the transformative uh, quality, the changing of
Mm-hmm.
our world into some other world in which can tell us about ourselves. We can step back and try to deal with the problems that we have. And so
Mm-hmm.
it is almost impossible to correctly define what a fairy tale is. I mean, uh,
Mm-hmm.
academicians have made their living by categorizing narratives like ghost stories uh, and war stories, this, so on and so forth. But fairy tales are really hybrid. Their quality depends upon the imaginative sort of plot that is presented to us. And these tales,
Mhm.
we have to remember, were basically oral tales. It wasn't really, the printing press was not invented until about the 16th century, and so what? There was no TV, there were no radio,
Mhm.
there was no other type of media except mouth to mouth.
Mhm.
And these tales were told even today. We continue to tell tales. It's extremely important. I mean, on radio, I don't know. There's a program now of the moth tales. I don't know whether you listen
Mhm.
to the radio, and
It's on the
and
NPR radio show.
exactly. They're not
Mhm.
necessarily fairy tales, but it's this to share tales with other people and it brings about a type of community, and that's what the fairy tales are all about. They're about
Mhm.
community, about sharing experiences that are extraordinary, so that we
Mhm.
can sort of wake up and say, "What's going on here?" or "How who thought of this and why?"
Yeah.
So that's why. Uh, when people ask me to define a fairy tale, I can't.
Mhm.
I mean, I can talk about the plots, how we can sort of there tale types that academicians have noted, and like dictionaries of similar tales throughout the world, and they're very useful. It helps us understand other cultures and how
Mhm.
and why they deal with the whole question of imagination. Um, many of my friends uh, are in Asia, in China and India and so on. And they send me quite often tales that are startling and so similar to some of the tales that we have here in America. And it's unbelievable uh, to,
Do you have an example?
well, I, the examples, uh, I'll come back to Little Red Riding Hood. In China, there's a tale about a young girl and a tiger, uh, who a tiger, because there are no wolves in China, uh, and it's this tiger is menacing and lives in a tree, and this young girl uh, is sent on a chore for the family to bring things to her grandmother, and sees this tiger in this tree, and the tiger jumps after her but is stupid and can't capture her. This is a Chinese tale, okay,
Uh-huh.
and it's not people who have read. These are tales that have existed since the medieval times, and they
Uh-huh.
eventually, when the printing press came into being, they began writing these tales down the way we do here in America or in Europe and so on. And the big turning point is, of course, the printing press throughout the world,
Mhm.
because it enabled us to save and use these tales for to try to urge people to act in a different way, because as I pointed out, if you look at some of the key tales like Cinderella. Uh, it's a tale about uh, a broken family, divorced family, where a woman dies and her child is treated after the husband, uh, the father marries somebody else after his
Mhm.
wife dies, and there's a girl who's neglected because when the father marries another woman, uh, the woman has maybe two daughters, or and they want to inherit everything, and so they treat uh, Cinderella, or the heiress, who the natural heiress would be. Uh, it's all about, if you look today, how do mixed families survive?
Mhm.
There's so many divorces, so many ways that creates mixed families in,
Mhm.
in our civilization. And again, here we see the mimetic quality of these tales. We tell them because they're necessary. They sort of help us understand why somebody may be betrayed or uh, 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 exploited, and these tales then become the necessity tales that we need to move on. We keep changing these tales. We have to adapt these tales because uh, our lives change rapidly, have been changing rapidly. And we have different ways that we behave and so on. And so we respond to these changes by telling new tales that are based on former tales, that to signal that there are things that we can do. For instance, it was for me stunning particularly in the 1970s and 1980s, when the feminist movement became so strong and questioning sort of the patriarchy of our societies, uh, that uh, the tales flourished in which uh, the different characters, particularly women in these tales, were pictured or depicted as stronger than they
Mm.
were previously. And we have to ask why. And then in certain societies, still today, where women are forced to wear masks, so to speak, or clothes
Mhm.
that covers their identity, there are tales that challenge that today, and
Mhm.
and create changes in a lot of the Middle Eastern countries, and or in India, and also China again. These tales won't go away. They're going to continue
Mhm.
to be told, to question, is this what we want? Will this really be fruitful for our children in the future? And so uh, it's extremely important to realize the political power of fairy tales.
So, can you talk a little bit? You mentioned Cinderella, and that brought up for me how fairy tales almost. I mean, a lot of the Grimm fairy tales, especially, have evil stepmothers.
Yes,
Is there a reason that is such a pattern in the fairy tales from? I'm assuming from the Germanic area.
yes. Yeah. Well, again, the reason for that is somewhat, I wouldn't say simple, but uh, uh, women in the 19th century, or 18th and 17th century, they died quite often from childbirth,
Hmm.
and the deaths uh, compelled men who who may have had a family with the dead, with the dead woman, to seek out to marry again, or to find a woman
Hmm.
with whom uh, they can share uh, the education of children, or particular children. And witches, women were depicted as witches if they uh, help themselves. It was looked down upon by most religions if women took their lives uh, seriously, and controlled their lives, uh,
Hmm.
so that if uh, women who helped other women in uh, childbirth, uh, were used particular medicines that were not available, uh, widely, and
Mhm.
they had this sort of magical power. The churches, and other religions, uh, Christian religions, but also um, other religions, not just Christianity, look down upon women who develop their own sort of medicines, their ways to treat women in childbirth, or women in general. In general,
Mhm.
uh, and they were so, they the witches became very significant. Nobody knew what a witch was. It was just false. Uh, but it was a way to control women who were uppity, so to speak,
Mhm.
and so they were labeled witches.
Mhm.
There were also male witches in the medieval times, but for the most part, as organized religions formed, they were threatened, or felt threatened, by women who uh, might control their own bodies, might be able to use their own medicine, and so on and so forth. And so the notion that there were evil women was important for distinguishing the power that men had rather than women. In other words, uh, women who were too, let us say, strong, or smart, or intelligent, and so on, they were classified to a great extent as as witches. And then
Mhm.
it's the other side of it, which is interesting, is that in the 17th century, again, back to Madame de Noir, and the feminists of her period in the 1690s, they were banished, from the court, because of the fact, if they were too uppity, if they were too smart, too intelligent, and so on.
Mhm.
You have to realize that women uh, were really exploited up through the present day, and not allowed to have the type of education or lives that men had, the males had. And the tales reflect this. The tales show, uh, uh, which have no reason, like to portray Baba Yaga as a famous witch in Russia, or the
Mhm.
Eastern European countries. They were women who were strange, or strange because of the fact that they might live by themselves, and be called upon
Mhm.
by other families to help them. And so they had to be tagged with the term witch. And it's interesting, again, to show, again, mimetically, how certain terms evolve and turn against the original meaning. Because today, a lot of, at least in America, and to a certain extent in Europe, women like to be called witches. They're empowered. They have this magic power, and you see that in films. You see that also in the stories that are being written. That witches are no longer uh, evil.
Mhm.
They are very powerful and dangerous, and you have to be careful. And women claim that title now,
Mhm.
and have turned it around to serve their own purposes, because they want to be in charge of their own bodies, and their own
Mhm.
fates, and their own
Mhm.
families. And they want to be judges. They want to be equal. and a witch has helped them, or to be a
Mm-hmm.
witch today, at least in America, tends to be uh, a very smart and daring women.
Mm-hmm. I wanted to go back to a point that you were talking about with Louis the 14th, and how he was imprisoning specific women and people who were writing fairy tales. Why was he threatened by these tales?
By Louis the 14th.
Yes, I
Yeah,
believe that's who you
yeah.
said.
Well, Louis the 14th, which threatened not only by these women, but in the latter years of his power in the 1690s and beginning of the 18th century, there were a lot of uh, uh, um, well, let's see, a, a lot of the economy was not functioning, and there were people were starving. There were droughts. There were uh, and he uh, was very sensitive to any criticism that he received, and it's for that reason. Not it wasn't just the writing of fairy tales, but uh, the Catholic Church at that time was very rigid, and so any type of organizing, self-organizing, they had salons were very new in the 17th century. Women were inherited money, and there was nothing that they more than they can do except to have these types of salons because they weren't allowed to go to universities. They were not educated the way men were educated, and
Mm-hmm.
and so the type of let us say punishment uh, and again, Madame Donois was not afraid to write the types of tales that she wrote, and all these other women writers at that time. There were about 6 or 7 famous writers of fairy tales at that time, and so he was very angry at any type of, let us say, not uprising, but any type of uh, criticism of his
Mm.
laws. And they were, these women were in their own sly way. They were very smart, very intelligent. And so they were considered, uh, they should be banished.
Mm.
And this goes on today. I'm right now, I was about 2 or 3 weeks, or no, about a month ago. Uh, I received a letter from somebody from Iran, a professor at a university in Iran, who was writing to protect a woman who was sentenced to 2 years in prison. Uh, who she was a professor of children's literature at a university in Iran, and because of the fact that she spoke out as a feminist and also uh, wrote about the abuse of children in Iran. She was sentenced to 2 years in prison by the government, the Iranian government. It's the same thing repeating itself. It's
Mm-hmm.
it's horrific, horrific,
Mm-hmm.
and
Mm-hmm.
and so we these tales reflect, various tales reflect what is happening in different ways. It's a sort of a language is used, a subtle language is used, and you can do this. It's very interesting because of the metaphorical language that is used in fairy tales. You can escape sometimes a,
Mm-hmm.
a punishment, a critique, because generally speaking, people in power are dumb. They they're dumb and they don't understand sometimes when somebody writes something or creates something that is a critique of their power, uh, they don't realize it. They just barrel along, and is then if there's just maybe a hint of let us say uprising, uh, then the people will be punished. Uh,
Mm-hmm.
that happens in the fairy tales too.
Mm-hmm. You know, that brings me to a question I've always had when I watch, you know, any sort of movie with a very clear cut villain. The people who are obviously producing these atrocities or that are behaving in greedy manners, when they watch or when they read these stories, do they see themselves? I'm always curious, and I don't know, I'm not actually necessarily asking you if you know this, but it's always a question that comes up for me because there are people who, you know, fill the shoes of villains quite well in our own world. And so when they see these, you know, pieces of work, of movies or literature, are they seeing themselves in them, or are they just not even associating themselves with,
Well,
you know, those characters?
it's a difficult. It's a great question you've asked, and uh, if you take Mr. Trump,
Mm-hmm.
he is a narcissist, the worst
Mm-hmm.
kind of narcissist in the world, and uh, and he believes that he's a victim and not an exploiter, a victim
Right.
when things go wrong for him. And so all I can say is for the most part, I think dictators and people like Trump uh, really have no idea of how much misery they have caused in this world. They only think of themselves. They only think of
Mm-hmm.
the more power and money they can accrue is benefits everybody, and that they should be praised for leading the lives they lead and setting the laws that they need in order
Mm-hmm.
to continue to exploit everybody in their society. And it is a crime. It's a shame
Mm-hmm.
to see this, these, and to see how people follow these narcissistic people, vote
Mm-hmm.
for them,
Mm-hmm.
uh, and uh, they are ice cold people who can't think about anything else except themselves.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Well, let's talk a little bit about some of your books. So you did mention the Trials and Tribulations of Little Red Riding Hood, which is just fascinating. But one of the first books that you wrote was Breaking the Magic Spell: Radical Theories of Folk and Fairy Tales, and you recently did a revising of this book. Can you tell us a little bit about this book?
Yeah, Breaking the Magic Spell uh, came out, if I recall it, I'm trying to, in the 1970s, if I recall.
I think it was
And
1979.
yeah, and it was somewhat controversial because up until that time, I'm not a I never studied uh, at the university to become a folklorist. That was not my field. Now people call me folklorist because I've written so much about folklore and so on and so forth. So maybe I am a folklorist. I don't know. I don't know who I am sometimes. So at, at any rate, the uh, oh, what was your question again? You
Oh
said,
yes, the the Breaking the Magic Spell. Can you
oh,
tell
right,
us a little
right,
bit about
yeah,
the book and the
yeah,
revisions?
right. In that that book caused a shock, and because in the folklore, I'm trying to remember the American Folklore Society. Uh,
Mm-hmm.
was very rigid in its approach to folklore and fairy tales, and they everything was classified, or you basically only studied not the contents, not the historical context, but you basically just studied the structure of the narrative, how plots were developed, how artistic somebody, a writer was, or uh, types of findings that people would make as anthropologists.
Hmm.
And so things were cozy, in and not really experimental in terms of analyzing uh, tales and
Hmm.
analyzing the social, historical, and power that tales have. And when my book came out, it was basically a book that exploded uh, certain notions, or there weren't any notions
Uh-huh.
that the folklorists had at that time, and so uh, I was sort of considered somewhat of a uh, troublemaker in, in really a
Hmm.
troublemaker in the field, and because I began using critical theory and historical research to interpret these tales and to show to what extent they are so relevant today, or why, to answer the question of why they stick around.
Hmm.
I also wrote a book about the how fairy tales stick, uh,
Mm.
and in our minds, and why, and so on and so forth. And so that book, which critiqued a lot of the leading folklorists of the time, uh, uh, the people in that society became very angry with me. But that didn't last long, fortunately, because my ideas spread
Hmm.
and influenced a lot of young people. Uh, who is this guy who's coming out of the blue? As I said, I didn't study folklore. I
Right.
didn't write. Uh, I didn't write according to the way they wrote.
Hmm.
Uh, and so I was very fortunate in a way, because that to, led to invitations to teach or guest appearances at various universities, not only in America but also in Canada and the UK and Europe. And so I've learned a lot from the critiques. So
Hmm.
I take them seriously. And almost all of my books, uh, I think, are based on my continual experience with other thinkers who have helped me understand my own life and the academy, the way the academy politically is run.
Hmm.
The universities today have become corporations. They're
Hmm.
no longer really educating people. They're sort of uh, giving them 4 years of misery because now they have to pay $50,000 a year.
Hmm.
Can you imagine that? $50,000 a year. When I went to uh, the university, the city universities in New York City were free. My,
Wow.
I paid maximum. I paid when I went to Columbia. I paid something like $3,000 a semester,
Hmm.
maximum,
You're right.
and
And
so
that
on.
that was private tuition.
Yes, that's a
Hmm.
but and the state most of the public universities up until the 1970s were free or very low. Maybe you paid $1,000 or $2,000 a year.
Hmm.
Uh, at the University of Minnesota, where I'm at, when I first arrived here, these students were paying $10,000 a year. guess what it is now? Fourth,
30.
yeah, no, forty
Oh my
thousand.
gosh.
Yeah. Do you know what the football coach earns every year? $4 million.
What? I had no
Oh,
idea.
oh, yes. Oh, you're go check out San Antonio and the football team and find out what the coach makes, and the assistant coaches make
Uh-huh.
billions of dollars.
Yeah. That's
This is what we
crazy.
call education in
Right.
America. Is uh, it's ridiculous. It's perverse.
Mm-hmm.
I don't know
Um,
what this has to do with fairy tales.
oh, you were talking about the controversy around your book and
Yes,
the lessons you were learning from the critiques that people
yes, yeah,
were giving
yeah.
you.
So my curi- my interest has developed to the point that I want to understand why uh, major thinkers, writers, artists, musicians uh, are not recognized today from the past, or who are they? Or why have they been silenced?
Mm-hmm.
And my most recent book uh, uh, deals with that. It's this book. It's called The Buried Treasures.
Okay.
Right there,
Mm-hmm.
and it's a study of about 10 or 12 brilliant 20th and 21st century writers and artists, and to why they. I've tried to excavate their works, and actually, I formed my own publishing company for about 3 years. It no longer exists because I was, as a one-person uh, publisher and editor, I went out of my mind after a while. But I did publish 7 books based
Oh.
from these authors, all the authors in my book Buried Treasures, The Power of Political Fairy Tales. I've managed to get the rights to their works because
Mm-hmm.
it's still either I could buy the rights or they were free because these are
Mm-hmm.
writers from the 1930s, 40s in Europe and America. And
Mm-hmm.
so I've been trying to recapture what the recapture their lives, recapture their works, and
Mm-hmm.
to try to spread the word that these are important. Uh, Let us say important works because they were all of these writers and artists were rebelling against what was going on during that time. There were 2 world wars. Uh,
Mm-hmm.
the beginning of the 20th century became the beginning of the sort of nuclear wars that were going to really occur. And
Mm-hmm.
the all of these writers risked their lives. None of these writers, uh, because they were banished or punished or threatened. Some of them were Jewish, and it was sort of they were threatened by the Holocaust. We have the most bloody century behind us
Mm-hmm.
that that has probably continued, unfortunately, today. But it really was out in the open in the 2 world wars. And these writers escaped. Some of them came to America from Europe, uh, and they published here. They wrote works here, and so I've tried to bring them, restore the importance that they have, and
Mm-hmm.
I've continued to do this up until up today. I mean, even at 86, I continue to write and excavate these works, and also to write my own. I I'm starting to write my own as I go down the road.
We both froze. I froze for a minute and then you froze. um, so I started to read the first chapter, and there was a story about Einstein that I
Yes,
wondered if you could retell for us.
yes. Well, yes, I could do. Do you want me to tell it the way I sometimes tell it, or do you want me to? Yes.
However you think is best.
Okay, I'll try. So I'll try it without looking at the text itself.
Okay.
So one day when Einstein, who was living in Princeton in the 1940s and teaching at Princeton, he was walking down through a park and after teaching and uh, having a pleasant walk. All of a sudden, a old woman was dragging this little boy who's about 9 or 10 years old through the park and yelled out to him, Mr. Einstein, Mr. Einstein, stop. And Einstein was shaken by this and turned around, and there was this woman who was dragging this boy up to him. And she said, Mr. Einstein, I want to ask you a question. And Einstein said, oh, certainly. And he took out his pipe. And she says, Miss Einstein, no, you shouldn't smoke. It's no good for you. So Einstein was sort of shaken by this and said, Mr. Einstein, I want my son, my grandson, to become like you. Tell me, what should he read? And Einstein says, well, I think he should read fairy tales. And the old woman was shaken by this and said, but Mr. Einstein, yes, good, no, I'll do it. But what else should he do? And Einstein took his pipe, put it in his mouth, and said he should read more fairy tales. And he left. And the woman continued to drag the boy through the park and stopped and said, Jakey, I want you to listen, to remember from here on in, you read fairy tales.
That's such a wonderful story.
Yes, yeah, no, it is.
And was that you?
It's a family legend uh, that I did. I mean, I don't remember everything.
Mhm.
I did go to see my grandmother in at that time, around that
Mhm.
time, and supposedly she took me in through a park and met
Mhm.
Einstein. And to what? And I can't. My parents are no longer alive, but it was told continually,
Mhm.
so that it, again it sticks into your head
Right.
because it has some significance.
Absolutely. And that, I don't know if you noticed, but in our email correspondence, but that's one of my quotes that I have at the very bottom of in my signature. If you, I don't remember exactly what it said, but if you want to be smart, read fairy tales. If you want to be really smart, read more fairy tales.
Yes,
Something to that extent.
yeah,
So to hear where that actual quote came from,
right. Right.
um, is just awesome.
Yeah.
So we're winding up. We're starting to get to the hour point, but can you tell us what you feel like you really wanted to accomplish with your books? What do you want people to be walking away with?
Well, there's another side to me that we haven't talked about because it's a side that is extremely important. I told you that when I moved to Milwaukee and I then read all these books about children's education and socialization and so on. I actually when I went into the schools, I became a storyteller.
Mm.
I studied storytelling, and I developed a method that uh, to help children to become storytellers of their own lives. So that's my philosophy, that it's really important that all children become storytellers of their own lives.
Mhm.
And I developed, after leaving the University of Wisconsin in Milwaukee, I went to Florida briefly. I began going into schools there too, in Florida, telling tales. And then after my wife said, uh, uh, she's from Minneapolis, uh, and she didn't like being in the South, and she was threatened one time by people carrying guns in a
Mm.
playground, and she said, "We're going north. You're leaving your job. You have to find a job." And by chance, luck, I wound up in Minneapolis, where she's from.
Mm.
She actually grew up in right nearby at the Mayo Clinic in Rochester, Minnesota. But nevertheless, it was where her family was, and I immediately wanted to go into schools again, and I met a wonderful storyteller who had an entree to an elementary school in Minneapolis, in the working class district. And I began telling tales there. And then 2 years later, a very good friend of mine uh, who uh, knew George Soros in New York came and saw what I was doing, came to and thought, you really should develop this and make it into a program, and and let's see whether you can get a connection to the Children's Theater Company of Minneapolis, huge place where they do plays for children and so on. And it turns out that a year after all of this happened, with my friend coming from New York, uh, another young man whom I had influenced came and became the artistic director of the Children's Theater and said, "Jack, I want you to develop any program you want." And I developed a program it was called Building Bridges between different neighborhoods and so on. And I trained over the years about 50 young artists, mainly actors, from the to to go into schools in the intercity and to work one whole year with one class, to stay with that one class, and to develop their, let us say, creativity,
Mm.
so that they can become storytellers of their own lives. And this program received rather prizes, various prizes, and was developed in other parts of the United States. And I felt more at home working with these in my program as a second job in,
Mm.
in Minneapolis. I literally flew to different places. I trained people and worked myself in the schools. And it, up until uh, 2021, when was the uh, uh, endemic started, about
Yeah, 2020.
they had to cancel the program.
Mm.
But the people I trained on their own took one of my books called Speaking Out, and they formed
Mhm.
a new company. You can look it up on they have a huge website, and they have now
Mhm.
developed their own company called Speaking Out. I'm on the board of directors, and but it's their work. They're doing it. I feel so proud of them, uh,
Mm.
and they deserve all the credit. you know, for what they're doing. And that has been sort of my, let us say, contribution to trying to change this stupid world.
So, why is it important for children to be able to tell their own stories?
I, it give them a sense of their own autonomy, that
Mm,
they can be autonomous, and they do learn. The program really focuses on them and not on our storytelling and so on. It's a very 2 hour session once a week throughout the whole semester. Of course, now it's gone because of what's happened, but it worked
mhm.
and was recognized, and as I said, uh, received rather some, I wouldn't say prizes, but some help uh, monetarily.
So, do the children are they creating like personal narrative stories, or are they doing
They,
fairy tale stories, or is it kind of
they learn
combination?
to give you an example. Uh, uh, I can, within maybe 30 seconds, I can get a class to start writing by asking them, uh, please, what's your favorite animal? And somebody will say elephant, and I write
Hmm.
it on the board. And then I'd say, so what do you like most when you're eating? What do you use? And somebody will say fork. I use a
Hmm.
fork. And I say, well, let's connect that with uh, with an and or it, or with, as, and so on and so forth. And so they say, and so I write on the board elephant on the fork, and I say, okay, you have 5 minutes to write a story on elephant on the fork. And so these write these stories that once upon a time there was an elephant who needed, who desperately needed a fork to dig up some food and so on and so forth. And so they developed these stories, and then I asked them to come up and tell to for about maybe 5 or 10 minutes. Two or three people come up and read their stories to the other people, and then we sit down and in a circles. We've cleared the entire. We've changed the room
Hmm.
into a playroom,
Mm.
and there are no desks. We push them to the side, and we sit down and we share their stories, and then we ask them to develop groups among themselves, taking one of the stories, and they are going to act it out. And they can use music, they can do anything they want. So this all happens in 2 hours,
Mm.
and it carries over. The next week is another sort of exploration of a particular tale and so on.
Mhm.
And they develop a literacy. They develop confidence. Uh,
Mhm.
it's absolutely uh, these are inner city schools
Mhm.
where it's very difficult. And I was threatened sometimes walking into particular schools that are that have police
Mhm.
guarding anybody who goes in the doors. So we need programs like that. We need more and more programs like that. It's wonderful that young people I've changed, I've trained, I've gone on, and they too have benefited from
Mhm.
this engagement with me and with the schools. And so let's continue in a way. It's a shame that there aren't more opportunities for us to do what we want to do. But I'm still struggling, even in my old age,
In your happily retired state.
in my happily yes, I am happily retired. Yes,
But still very active, it seems, as you're still
yes,
writing books.
definitely, definitely. Yes,
Well, we definitely appreciate you coming on Fabric of Folklore. Thank you so much for this enlightening conversation.
yes. Thank you very much, Vanessa. And I wish you cool days there in Texas.
Thank you. We definitely need the cool days to
Yeah.
come to Texas, and also rain. We need
Yeah.
rain.
Okay. Okay.
And thank
I'll see if I can magically help you out.
Yes, if you could, that would be amazing. And thank you, folksy folks, for joining us on this magical fairy tale journey. All of the links that we have talked about, including the links to his books, will be on our website, which is www.fabricoffolklore.com. We mentioned, I think, 3 books, and we'll definitely link to his website, as well as the Speaking Out program that he was instrumental in helping to spearhead. And we want to hear from you folksy folks, the audience. We want to hear what your thoughts are. What do you think are the significant political implications of fairy tales? Did you read them growing up, and did they empower you to feel like you had the ability to change the world? We have a Facebook community group page, where you can continue the conversation after this podcast has finished. So please make sure you have joined our Facebook group, and we're also on all of the socials: Twitter, Instagram, Facebook, YouTube. Please like, comment, subscribe, and share. And if you are on a podcasting platform, if you could write us a review and give us stars, that is so incredibly helpful for a new podcast like ourselves. Thank you once again for listening to Fabric of Folklore. I am Vanessa Y. Rogers, your hostess, the podcast where we unravel the mysteries of folklore. And until next time, keep the folk alive.